I was sitting on my front porch in Bend, Oregon, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my private driveway when a massive recreational vehicle rumbled to a stop at the end of my property. The thing was at least 40 feet long, chrome gleaming like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, and it sat there idling for a good 5 minutes before a woman in her mid-50s climbed out of the passenger side, her blonde highlights catching the light as she marched toward me with the kind of determination that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. My name is Andrew Jackson, no relation to the president, and I had moved to this 5-acre property about 3 years ago specifically because it offered privacy and seclusion. The land sat at the end of a long private road that I owned, maintained, and paid taxes on. It was not a public thoroughfare, not a county road, and definitely not subject to anyone's opinion but mine. The gravel drive was about a quarter-mile long, winding through ponderosa pines and juniper trees, wide enough for my truck and the occasional delivery vehicle, but certainly not designed for land yachts like the one currently blocking my entrance. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch that suggested she was used to getting her way. "Are you the owner of this property?" I set down my coffee mug and stood up, walking to the edge of my porch. "I am. Can I help you with something?" She planted her hands on her hips, and I noticed she was wearing a crisp white polo shirt with an embroidered logo that read, "Meadowbrook HOA board member." That was interesting, considering Meadowbrook was the housing development about 2 miles down the main county road, a place I had specifically avoided when house hunting, because I wanted nothing to do with homeowners associations and their endless rules about mailbox colors and lawn height. "My name is Patricia Fleming, and I am the vice president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I should be impressed. "We have been trying to reach the owner of this property for weeks now." "Well, you found me," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Though I should mention I am not part of your HOA. My property is not in your development." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Yes, we are aware of that technicality. However, your private road connects to Meadowbrook Drive, which feeds into our community, and we have some concerns about access." I felt my jaw tighten. "My road does not connect to Meadowbrook Drive. My road connects to County Road 47, which happens to intersect with several other roads, one of which eventually leads to your development. But there is no direct connection." "Semantics," Patricia said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "The point is, several of our residents have recently purchased recreational vehicles, and we need to use alternative routes for easier access to the national forest and camping areas. Your road would provide the perfect shortcut." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. "You want to use my private road as a shortcut?" "Not just a shortcut," she corrected, pulling out her phone and tapping at the screen. "We need you to widen it to accommodate larger vehicles. My husband and I just purchased this beautiful 2025 four-travel Realm, and it is simply impossible to navigate the narrow county roads to reach the Forest Service roads. Your route would cut 15 minutes off our drive time." "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said, descending the porch steps and walking closer to where she stood. "You want me to widen my private road, which I own and maintain with my own money, so that you and your HOA friends can drive your RVs through my property?" Patricia smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "We are prepared to offer compensation, of course. The HOA board has discussed this, and we are willing to contribute $500 toward the widening costs. We estimate it should not cost more than a few thousand to bring the road up to proper standards." I actually laughed at that, which clearly offended her based on the way her smile vanished. A few thousand. Lady, do you have any idea what it costs to properly widen and grade a quarter-mile road? We are talking heavy equipment, drainage considerations, environmental permits, and probably $20,000 minimum, and that is if everything goes smoothly. And you want to chip in $500 for the privilege of using my property. Her expression hardened. There is no need to be rude, Mr. Jackson, Andrew Jackson. And I am not being rude, I am being realistic. The answer is no. You cannot use my road, and I am certainly not widening it for your convenience. Patricia's face flushed red, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. You do not understand. This is not a request. The Meadowbrook HOA has discussed this at length, and we have determined that your road represents the best option for community access. We are prepared to take legal action if necessary. Legal action, I crossed my arms. For what? You have no legal standing here. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property, and you certainly cannot force me to modify my private road. We will see about that, Patricia snapped. I know several attorneys who specialize in property law, and I am quite sure we can find a legal avenue to compel your cooperation. Furthermore, your refusal to work with the community reflects poorly on you as a neighbor. I am not your neighbor, I pointed out. I am a property owner 2 miles away who wants nothing to do with your HOA. Now, if you would please move your RV, I have things to do. Patricia glared at me for another moment before spinning on her heel and stalking back to her vehicle. I watched as she climbed into the passenger seat, and the RV began a laborious 15-point turn to get back onto the county road. The thing was so large it had to back up at least 6 times, and I could see Patricia gesturing frantically through the windshield, probably berating her husband about the tight space. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox from the law offices of Henderson and Associates in Bend. The letter, written in dense legalese that probably cost someone $200 an hour to compose, claimed that my private road constituted a quasi-public thoroughfare based on historical usage patterns, and that the Meadowbrook HOA had a legitimate interest in ensuring adequate access to public lands. It demanded that I contact their office within 10 business days to discuss reasonable modifications to the road or face potential litigation. I sat in my kitchen reading the letter 3 times, my coffee growing cold beside me. The whole thing was absurd. My road had never been public. There were no historical usage patterns beyond my own vehicles and occasional guests, and the idea that an HOA 2 miles away had any say in my property decisions was laughable. But the letter was real, printed on expensive letterhead, and it represented the opening salvo in what could become a very expensive legal battle. I called my own attorney, a guy named Michael Ross, who had handled my property purchase and knew the ins and outs of Oregon property law. His office was in downtown Bend, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. Michael was in his early 40s, balding, with the kind of rumpled appearance that suggested he spent more time reading case law than worrying about his wardrobe. He read the letter from Henderson and Associates while I sat across from his cluttered desk, and I watched his eyebrows climb higher with each paragraph. "This is creative," he finally said, setting the letter down. "Completely without merit, but creative. So they have no case." "Not even close," Michael assured me. "Your road is private property, clearly marked as such, and there is no historical public usage that would establish any kind of easement or right-of-way. This whole quasi-public thoroughfare argument is nonsense. They are basically hoping you will not know your rights and will cave to the pressure." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. So what do I do? I will draft a response letter explaining, in very clear terms, that their claims are baseless, and that any attempt to access or modify your property without permission will be treated as trespassing and property damage. I will also point out that frivolous litigation can result in sanctions and fee recovery, which should make them think twice about actually filing a lawsuit. How much is this going to cost me? Michael shrugged. For the letter, a few hundred. If they are stupid enough to actually file suit, we will cross that bridge when we come to it. But honestly, Andrew, I think this is all bluster. HOAs tend to be very bold when they think they can bully someone, but they fold pretty quickly when faced with actual legal consequences. I left Michael's office feeling better, but still uneasy. I had moved to Oregon to get away from exactly this kind of nonsense, the petty power plays and manufactured drama that seemed to follow certain types of people wherever they went. I had worked hard as a software engineer for 15 years, saved my money, and bought this property specifically so I could live life on my own terms. The idea that some HOA busybody thought she could dictate what I did with my land made my blood boil. 3 days later, I was working in my garage when I heard vehicles approaching. I stepped outside to find not one but 3 cars parked at the entrance to my property. Patricia Fleming emerged from the first vehicle, accompanied by 2 other women and a man who looked deeply uncomfortable to be there. All of them wore matching polo shirts with the Meadowbrook HOA logo. "Mr. Jackson," Patricia called out, her tone saccharine sweet. "We thought we would come by for a friendly visit to discuss this situation like reasonable neighbors." I wiped my hands on a rag and walked toward them, stopping a good 20 feet away. "I received your attorney's letter. My attorney will be responding appropriately. There is nothing to discuss." One of the other women, a brunette in her early 50s, stepped forward. "I am Sandra Mitchell, president of the Meadowbrook HOA. I think perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. We are not trying to be adversarial here. We are simply trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "There is no solution that works for everyone," I said bluntly. "The solution that works for me is that you leave my property alone and find another route for your RVs. That is not negotiable." The man, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "Look, I am Robert Chen, treasurer of the HOA. We have actually revised our offer. The board is now willing to contribute $2,000 toward the road widening, and we would ensure that only HOA members in good standing would have access. We could even install a gate system that you would control." "Let me ask you something," I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you folks understand that this is my private property? Not community property, not shared property, but mine," Patricia scoffed. "We understand property rights, Mr. Jackson, but we also understand that being part of a community means making reasonable compromises for the greater good." "I am not part of your community," I repeated, feeling like I was talking to a wall. "I specifically chose not to live in an HOA development. I bought this land, I maintain this road, and I will decide what happens with it. And my decision is no. No access, no widening, no gates, no anything. Is that clear enough?" Sandra's friendly demeanor cracked slightly. "We are trying to be reasonable here. Surely you can appreciate that your stubbornness is affecting dozens of families who simply want to enjoy the recreational opportunities this area offers. They can enjoy those opportunities by using the public roads like everyone else," I shot back. "Your lack of planning is not my emergency. If your members bought RVs that are too big to navigate the local roads, that is their problem, not mine." Patricia's face flushed that familiar angry red. "You know what your problem is? You are selfish. You sit up here on your little 5 acres acting like you are some kind of king, but you are just a lonely, bitter man who does not understand what it means to be part of something bigger than himself. I felt my temper flare, but I kept my voice calm. And you are a busybody who cannot stand the idea that someone is not falling in line with your demands. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff. The sheriff? Patricia laughed harshly. Call them. We are standing on the county easement, which is public property. We have every right to be here. She was technically correct. The first 20 feet or so of my driveway crossed a county easement where utility lines ran, but they were still close enough to be intimidating, and the veiled threat in Patricia's voice was clear. Fine, I said. Then stay there as long as you like. I have work to do. I turned and walked back to my garage, feeling 4 sets of eyes boring into my back. I heard them talking among themselves, their voices low and angry, but I ignored them. After about 10 minutes, the cars started up and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Patricia's words about being selfish and bitter. The truth was, I liked my solitude. I had never been the social butterfly type, preferring a few close friends to a large circle of acquaintances. My ex-wife had hated that about me, constantly pushing me to be more outgoing, to join clubs and attend neighborhood parties. The divorce had been messy, but ultimately it freed me to live the life I actually wanted. And what I wanted was peace, quiet, and the freedom to make my own choices without a committee voting on them. The next morning, I drove into Bend to run some errands. When I returned home around 2 in the afternoon, I immediately knew something was wrong. There were tire tracks leading up my driveway, heavy treads that definitely did not belong to my truck. I followed them up the road and felt my stomach drop when I saw what had happened. Someone had dumped a massive pile of gravel right in the middle of my driveway, about halfway to my house. The pile was at least 6 feet high and spread across the entire width of the road, completely blocking access. There was no note, no explanation, just tons of gravel sitting on my private property. I pulled out my phone and took pictures from every angle, documenting the blockage and the tire tracks. Then I called the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office and filed a report. The deputy who responded, a young guy named Officer Martinez, was sympathetic but not particularly hopeful about catching whoever did it. Without witnesses or camera footage, it is going to be tough to prove who dumped this, he explained, walking around the gravel pile. Could be vandalism, could be someone got the wrong address for a delivery. You have any enemies, Mr. Jackson? I told him about the HOA situation, showing him the attorney letter and explaining the confrontations. Officer Martinez took notes and nodded thoughtfully. I cannot make any accusations without evidence, he said. But I will note in the report that you are having a dispute with the Meadowbrook HOA. If anything else happens, that establishes a pattern. In the meantime, you are going to need to get this gravel moved. After the officer left, I sat in my truck staring at the pile and doing some mental math. Getting this much gravel delivered would have cost several $100s, and whoever ordered it had deliberately blocked my access. It was a message, a warning shot across the bow. The HOA was willing to escalate this situation, and they wanted me to know they were not backing down. I called a local excavation company and explained the situation. The owner, a gruff guy named Dale who sounded like he had been in the business for decades, told me he could send a crew out the next day to move the gravel. It would cost me $800, but he could spread it along the sides of my driveway to at least make use of the material. Sounds like you got yourself an HOA problem, Dale observed. I have dealt with those folks before. They can be real pieces of work. You know the Meadowbrook HOA? Oh yeah, Dale chuckled. They called me about 6 months ago wanting me to bid on a road widening project inside their development. I went out there, took measurements, gave them a quote of about 30 grand for the work they wanted. You know what they said? They said I was price gouging and tried to negotiate me down to 15,000. I told them to pound sand. You cannot do quality excavation work for half the market rate, and anyone who says they can is either lying or cutting corners. That was interesting information. So the HOA knew exactly how much road widening cost, which meant they were deliberately low-balling their offers to me. They had never intended to pay a fair share of the work. They just wanted to bully me into doing it at my own expense. Dale's crew showed up the next morning with a small excavator and spent 4 hours clearing my driveway. The gravel got spread along the edges, actually improving the road surface in some places, which felt like a small victory. But I was out $800, and I was angry. Angry enough to drive down to the Meadowbrook development and see exactly what I was dealing with. Meadowbrook turned out to be one of those cookie-cutter suburban developments that had sprung up around Bend in the last decade, taking advantage of the city's growing popularity. The houses were large, modern, and packed close together, with tiny yards and shared common areas. Every mailbox was identical, every lawn was manicured to the same height, and there were signs everywhere listing HOA rules and regulations. It looked like my personal version of hell. I drove through the streets slowly, noting the layout and looking for the RVs that had supposedly caused this whole mess. I found them parked in a dedicated storage area near the back of the development, a dozen or more massive recreational vehicles sitting side by side behind a chain-link fence. Patricia's for-travel realm was easy to spot, the chrome gleaming even in the overcast morning light. What struck me was that there was already clear access from the development to County Road 47, the same road my driveway connected to. The HOA residents did not need my road at all, they just wanted a slightly shorter route. This was not about necessity, it was about convenience and entitlement. I was about to leave when a security guard approached my truck. He was an older gentleman, probably retired, wearing a uniform that was slightly too large for his frame. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked politely. "Just looking around," I said. "I have been having some interactions with the HOA board trying to understand the layout here." The guard's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "You are the fellow with the private road, are you not? Andrew Jackson." "That is me. I am guessing you have heard about the situation." He glanced around, then leaned closer to my window. "Listen, I am just a guy who sits at the gate and makes sure nobody parks where they should not. But I have been doing this job for 2 years, and I can tell you that Patricia Fleming is not someone you want to mess with. She gets an idea in her head, and she does not let it go. Last year, she got 3 board members voted out because they did not support her plan to ban basketball hoops in driveways." "Basketball hoops," I repeated, incredulous. "Said they were unsightly and lowered property values," the guard explained. She had a whole presentation with photos and statistics. The woman is relentless. I thanked the guard for the information and drove home, my mind racing. It was becoming clear that this was not just about a road or RV access. Patricia Fleming had decided that I was an obstacle to something she wanted, and she was not going to stop until she either got her way or made my life miserable trying. Over the next week, things escalated. I received another certified letter, this time claiming that my private road represented a public safety hazard, because it limited emergency access to the national forest areas. The letter demanded I contact the county planning department to discuss bringing the road up to minimum safety standards. It was more nonsense, but it was nonsense that required time and money to refute. I also started noticing vehicles driving slowly past my property at odd hours. Nothing overtly threatening, just cars that would cruise by, slow down near my entrance, and then continue on. I installed a trail camera at the entrance to my driveway, angled to capture license plates. The camera paid off 3 days later when it caught Patricia Fleming herself driving past my property at 2 in the morning. She was in a white sedan, not the RV, and she slowed to a crawl at my entrance before continuing down the county road. There was no legitimate reason for her to be out there at that hour, and the fact that she was scoping out my property in the middle of the night sent a chill down my spine. I called Officer Martinez and sent him the trail camera footage. He was more concerned this time, noting that Patricia's behavior was starting to cross the line from civil dispute into potential harassment. "Keep documenting everything," he advised. "If she sets foot on your property without permission, call us immediately. We cannot do much about someone driving on a public road, but trespassing is a different story." My attorney Michael had sent his response letter to Henderson and Associates, and apparently it had been effective, because I received a terse reply stating that the HOA was reevaluating its legal options and would be in touch. That sounded like a temporary retreat, but I knew better than to think they had given up. I was proven right 2 weeks later, when I received a notice from the Deschutes County Planning Department. Someone had filed a formal complaint claiming that my private road was being used for commercial purposes without proper permits, and that I was operating an illegal business on my property. The complaint was anonymous, but I had a pretty good idea who had filed it. The problem was, the complaint triggered an automatic inspection process. A county inspector showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, ready to investigate. His name was Gary Thornton, and he seemed apologetic about the whole thing. "I have to follow up on all complaints," Gary explained, walking around my property. "Can you show me your business operations?" "There are no business operations," I said flatly. "I work remotely as a software engineer. My office is inside my house, and I have never had clients or customers come to this property. The only vehicles that use this road are my personal truck and occasional guests." Gary made notes and took some photos. "Do you do any commercial hosting? Airbnb, VRBO, anything like that?" "No. I live here, alone. I occasionally have friends visit, but that is it. Any agricultural operations, livestock, crop sales, timber harvesting. I have 5 acres of mostly trees and natural vegetation. I am not farming anything." Gary nodded, clearly seeing that the complaint was baseless. "I will file my report stating that I found no evidence of commercial activity. The complaint will be closed. Between you and me, Mr. Jackson, we get these kinds of spite complaints sometimes. Usually it is neighbors fighting over something petty. It wastes everyone's time." After Gary left, I sat on my porch and tried to calm down. The HOA was not just being annoying anymore. They were actively trying to damage me through false complaints and harassment. This had gone beyond a simple disagreement and entered the territory of a targeted campaign. That evening, I sat down and wrote out a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, from Patricia's initial visit to the dumped gravel to the false county complaint. I documented every letter, every confrontation, every suspicious incident. Then I called Michael Ross and asked him to come to my property for a meeting. Michael arrived the next day, and I walked him through everything while we sat at my kitchen table. He listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back and shook his head. "This has crossed the line from a civil property dispute into harassment and possibly worse," he said. "The dumped gravel, if we can prove the HOA was behind it, could be criminal vandalism and trespassing. The false county complaint could be actionable as well. You have grounds for a restraining order against Patricia Fleming personally, and potentially a cease and desist against the HOA as an organization. Will that stop them? It will make them think twice, Michael said. And if they violate a court order, they can face serious consequences, including contempt charges. But I have to warn you, Andrew, this could get expensive. Restraining orders require hearings, evidence, testimony. We are probably looking at several $1,000s in legal fees, maybe more if they fight it. I looked out the window at the pine trees swaying in the wind, at the property I had worked so hard to acquire and maintain. I am not letting them bully me off my own land, I said quietly. Do whatever needs to be done. Michael filed for a restraining order against Patricia Fleming 2 days later, citing the harassment, the suspicious nighttime surveillance, and the pattern of escalating behavior. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which meant I had to wait and hope nothing worse happened in the meantime. Something worse happened. I woke up one morning to find that someone had spray-painted graffiti on the large boulder that marked the entrance to my private road. The words "selfish jerk" were written in bright red paint, visible from the county road. I immediately called the sheriff's office, and Officer Martinez responded again, this time with a detective named Sarah Reeves. Detective Reeves was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and thorough. She photographed the graffiti, took paint samples, and reviewed the footage from my trail camera. Unfortunately, the camera angle did not capture the boulder clearly enough to identify who had done it. This is vandalism, clear and simple, Detective Reeves said. Combined with everything else you have documented, we are building a case of ongoing harassment. I am going to have a conversation with Patricia Fleming and the HOA board. Sometimes a visit from a detective is enough to make people realize they are crossing legal lines. And if it is not enough, Detective Reeves met my eyes. Then they will face charges: vandalism, harassment, possibly conspiracy if multiple board members are involved. This is not a game, Mr. Jackson. They are committing real crimes. I spent the rest of that day scrubbing paint off the boulder, my anger growing with each stroke of the wire brush. This was my home, my sanctuary, and these people were treating it like a battlefield in their petty war over convenience. Detective Reeves did follow through on her promise. She visited Patricia Fleming that afternoon, and apparently the conversation did not go well. I know this because I received an angry voicemail from Patricia calling me a coward for sixing the police on her, and insisting that she had done nothing wrong. The voicemail was unhinged enough that I forwarded it to Detective Reeves and Michael Ross, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. The restraining order hearing finally arrived 3 weeks later. I sat in a Deschutes County courtroom with Michael beside me, watching as Patricia Fleming entered with her attorney from Henderson and Associates. She looked composed and professional, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a conservative business suit. It was a far cry from the angry, red-faced woman I had dealt with on my property. The hearing was presided over by Judge Andrea Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics. Both sides presented their arguments. Michael laid out the timeline of harassment, showing photos of the dumped gravel, the vandalized boulder, and the trail camera footage of Patricia's late-night drive-by. He played the unhinged voicemail and submitted the false county complaint as evidence of a coordinated campaign of harassment. Patricia's attorney argued that his client was simply exercising her rights as a concerned community member, that the HOA had legitimate questions about road access and safety, and that Mr. Jackson was overreacting to normal neighbor interactions. He portrayed Patricia as a victim of a vindictive property owner who wanted to isolate himself from the community. Judge Morrison listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and then fixed Patricia with a steady gaze. "Mrs. Fleming, I have reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Jackson's attorney, and I find the pattern of behavior troubling," the judge said. "Whether or not you personally dumped gravel or spray painted that boulder, the evidence suggests a coordinated effort to pressure Mr. Jackson into modifying his private property for the benefit of your HOA. That is not legal community advocacy. That is harassment." Patricia's attorney started to object, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. "I am granting a temporary restraining order," the judge continued. "Mrs. Fleming, you are to have no contact with Mr. Jackson, directly or indirectly. You are not to approach his property, send communications through third parties, or engage in any behavior that could reasonably be construed as harassment. This order will remain in effect for 6 months, at which point we will review whether it needs to be extended. You understand?" Patricia's face had gone pale. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison added, "I am ordering you to pay Mr. Jackson's legal fees associated with obtaining this restraining order, which according to his attorney's filing amounts to $3,200. If I see you back in this courtroom for violating this order, the consequences will be far more severe. Court is adjourned." Michael and I left the courthouse, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. $3,000 would not cover all my expenses, but it was a moral victory as much as a financial one. The judge had seen through Patricia's act and recognized the harassment for what it was. "Think this will be the end of it?" I asked Michael as we stood in the parking lot. "With Patricia personally, probably," he said. "She would be stupid to violate a court order, but the HOA as an organization might still try something. We will see." I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic. Maybe the restraining order would be enough to make the HOA board realize they had pushed too far. Maybe I could finally get back to the quiet life I had moved here for. 2 days later, I received a letter from the Meadowbrook HOA board, signed by Sandra Mitchell as president. The letter stated that the board had voted to pursue a formal easement claim through the county, arguing that historical usage patterns and community need warranted establishing a legal right-of-way across my property. It was the same nonsense argument from before, just dressed up in slightly different legal language. I forwarded the letter to Michael, who sighed heavily when I called him to discuss it. "They are not going to win this," he assured me. "But they can drag it out and make it expensive for both sides. This is a war of attrition now. They are betting you will eventually give up rather than keep fighting." "Then they do not know me very well," I said. The county easement claim process turned out to be bureaucratic and slow-moving. The HOA had to submit evidence of historical usage, demonstrate public benefit, and navigate a series of administrative hearings. Michael filed responses to every claim, systematically dismantling their arguments with property records, historical documents, and testimony from Dale, the excavation contractor, about the true costs of road widening. Meanwhile, life went on. I continued working remotely, taking conference calls from my home office and writing code for clients who had no idea about the legal drama consuming my personal life. I started spending more time in Bend, frequenting local coffee shops and breweries, needing the human interaction after weeks of feeling under siege. It was at a brewery called Bend Ale House that I met Valerie Foster, a woman in her early 40s who taught history at Central Oregon Community College. We struck up a conversation at the bar, talking about the area's rapid growth and the changing character of the community. When I mentioned my HOA troubles, she laughed and shook her head. "I have heard horror stories about Meadowbrook," Valerie said. "One of my colleagues lives there, and she says the HOA board is absolutely tyrannical. They fined her $300 because her garage door was the wrong shade of beige." The wrong shade of beige. Apparently, there is an approved color palette, and she picked a color that was 2 shades too light, Valerie explained. She had to repaint the entire door at her own expense. The HOA even sent someone to inspect it afterward to make sure she got it right the second time. We talked for hours that night, and I found myself relaxing in a way I had not in months. Valerie was easy to talk to, intelligent and funny, and she seemed genuinely interested in my property dispute without being nosy or judgmental. We exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, we started seeing each other regularly. Having Valerie in my life provided a welcome distraction from the ongoing legal battle. The county hearings dragged on, with the HOA presenting increasingly desperate arguments about public access and community benefit. Michael methodically destroyed each claim, pointing out that there were multiple existing routes to the national forest areas, that my road had never been open to public use, and that the HOA's convenience did not override my property rights. 4 months after the restraining order hearing, the County Planning Commission issued its final ruling. The HOA's easement claim was denied in its entirety. The Commission's written decision was scathing, noting that the claim appeared to be motivated by private benefit rather than public necessity, and that the HOA had failed to demonstrate any legitimate basis for overriding established property rights. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I was wrong again. 3 weeks after the county ruling, I was having dinner with Valerie at my house when we heard vehicles approaching. It was after dark, around 9 in the evening, and I was not expecting anyone. I walked to the front window and felt my blood run cold. There were at least a dozen vehicles coming up my private road, headlights blazing, led by a massive RV that I immediately recognized as Patricia Fleming's for-travel realm. Behind it were more RVs, trucks, and SUVs, all driving slowly but deliberately onto my property. "Call 911, I told Valerie, already pulling out my phone to start recording video. By the time I got outside, the convoy had stopped about 100 feet from my house, engines still running. Patricia climbed out of the passenger seat of the lead RV, and even in the darkness, I could see the defiant set of her shoulders. A crowd of people emerged from the other vehicles, maybe 30 or 40 in total, many of them holding signs. The signs read things like "Roads are for everyone" and "No to property hoarders" and "Community over selfishness." It was a protest, right there on my private property in clear violation of the restraining order. "Patricia," I called out, holding up my phone, "I am recording this. You are violating a court order by being here." "This is not about me," Patricia shouted back. "This is about a community standing up for what is right. You cannot hide behind your property lines forever, Andrew. The people have a right to reasonable access. The people have a right to use public roads which exist and are available," I countered. "What you are doing right now is trespassing, all of you. The sheriff has been called." A man I did not recognize stepped forward. "We are not moving until you agree to negotiate in good faith. The HOA board has been more than reasonable, and you have responded with legal threats and police intimidation." "I have responded to harassment and vandalism with appropriate legal action," I shot back. "And if you all do not leave immediately, you are going to find yourselves facing criminal charges," the crowd murmured, some people looking uncertain, But Patricia raised her voice again, rallying them. Do not let him intimidate you. We have every right to peaceful protest. This is civil disobedience against unjust property hoarding. Valerie had come outside and was standing beside me now. Andrew, the dispatcher, says deputies are on the way, about 10 minutes out. Those were going to be a long 10 minutes. The crowd was getting more animated, people shouting questions and accusations at me. Someone called me a land baron. Another person accused me of stealing from the community. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a dystopian movie rather than real life in Central Oregon. I kept my phone up, recording everything, making sure to get clear shots of faces and license plates. Patricia was front and center, orchestrating the protest, seemingly unconcerned about the restraining order or the legal consequences. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The crowd heard them too, and some of the people started looking nervous, backing toward their vehicles. But Patricia held her ground, chin raised defiantly. 4 sheriff's vehicles arrived, followed by 2 Oregon State Police units. Officer Martinez was among the responding deputies, along with Detective Reeves. They quickly took in the scene, the crowd on private property, the signs, the RVs blocking the road. Detective Reeves approached Patricia directly. Mrs. Fleming, you are in violation of a court-ordered restraining order. You need to leave this property immediately. We are engaged in peaceful protest, Patricia insisted. We have First Amendment rights. Not on private property you do not, Detective Reeves said firmly. You have exactly 2 minutes to get back in your vehicle and leave, or you will be placed under arrest for trespassing and violation of a restraining order. Everyone else here has the same 2 minutes to clear out. The crowd began to disperse quickly, people scrambling back to their vehicles. But Patricia stood her ground for another moment, glaring at me with pure hatred. This is not over, she said. Actually, Mrs. Fleming, I think it is, Detective Reeves replied. Hands behind your back, please. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: shock, indignation, fear, as Detective Reeves pulled out handcuffs. You cannot be serious. Deadly serious. You were explicitly ordered by a judge to stay away from this property and to have no contact with Mr. Jackson. You violated that order in front of multiple witnesses and law enforcement officers. You are under arrest. Detective Reeves cuffed Patricia and led her to a patrol car while the crowd watched in stunned silence. The RVs and other vehicles began a slow, chaotic process of turning around and leaving my property. Officer Martinez stayed behind to take my statement and collect my phone footage as evidence. This is good video, Martinez said, reviewing the footage. Clear violation of the restraining order, evidence of trespassing, potentially conspiracy to commit trespass given the organized nature of the protest. The DA is going to have a field day with this. After all the vehicles had left and the deputies had finished taking statements, Valerie and I went back inside. I was shaking, adrenaline still coursing through my system. Valerie made us both tea while I sat at the kitchen table, trying to process what had just happened. That was intense, Valerie said quietly, setting a mug in front of me. Are you okay? I do not know, I admitted. I knew Patricia was obsessed, but I did not think she would actually violate a court order. She just destroyed any credibility she had. She organized a mob to invade your property, Valerie pointed out. That goes way beyond an HOA dispute. That is criminal. She was right. This had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Patricia Fleming was facing real criminal charges, and depending on how the district attorney decided to prosecute, she could be looking at jail time. The next morning, I received a call from Michael Ross. He had already heard about the previous night's events through the legal grapevine and was equal parts impressed and concerned. The good news is that Patricia Fleming just handed you a slam dunk case if you want to pursue civil damages, Michael said. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, harassment, trespassing. You could potentially sue both her and the HOA. What is the bad news? The bad news is that she has escalated this to a criminal level, and that means it is partly out of our hands now. The DA will decide how to prosecute, and depending on what happens, this could drag on for months or even years. Criminal cases move slowly. I just want this to be over, I said, exhausted. I want to live on my property in peace without worrying about angry mobs showing up. I understand, Michael said sympathetically. Let me reach out to the DA's office and see where things stand. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you install better security cameras and maybe consider hiring a security company for a few weeks, just to be safe. I took Michael's advice and had a professional security system installed within 2 days. Cameras covered every approach to my property, motion sensors monitored the driveway, and I had a direct line to a security company that could dispatch someone quickly if needed. It was expensive, but my peace of mind was worth it. Patricia Fleming was arraigned on charges of violating a restraining order and criminal trespass. She pleaded not guilty and was released on bail, though the judge extended the restraining order and added additional conditions, including no contact with any residents of my property and no organization of protests or demonstrations related to the property dispute. The Meadowbrook HOA board held an emergency meeting, and according to Valerie's colleague who lived there, it was absolute chaos. Many residents were furious that the board's obsession with road access had led to criminal charges and potential liability for the HOA. There were calls for the entire board to resign. Sandra Mitchell, the HOA president, released a statement trying to distance the organization from Patricia's actions, claiming that the protest had not been officially sanctioned and that Patricia had acted on her own initiative. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Multiple protesters that night had been wearing HOA-branded clothing, and the whole thing had clearly been organized through HOA channels. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter from a new attorney representing the Meadowbrook HOA. The letter was an apology. It acknowledged that the HOA board had overstepped in its dealings with me, that my property rights should have been respected from the beginning, and that the organization took full responsibility for the harassment I had endured. The letter also included a check for $15,000 as compensation for my legal fees and damages. I stared at the letter for a long time, trying to decide if it was genuine or just another tactical move. I called Michael to discuss it. "It is likely genuine," Michael said. HOAs are membership organizations, and if enough members are upset, they can force the board to change course. My guess is that the rank-and-file residents are worried about personal liability if this continues. $15,000 is probably them trying to cut their losses. Should I take it? "That is up to you," Michael said. "Taking the money does not prevent you from pursuing additional claims if you want to, but it might be a good faith gesture to accept it and see if things finally calm down. You can always escalate later if they start up again." I decided to cash the check. The money did not come close to covering the stress and time I had lost dealing with this situation, but it was something. And more importantly, it felt like an acknowledgement that I had been right all along. Patricia Fleming's criminal case moved forward slowly. She fired her original attorney and hired a more aggressive defense lawyer who tried to argue that she had been exercising her First Amendment rights and that the restraining order was overly broad. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney James Morrison, was having none of it. They had video evidence, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of harassment. The case went to trial 6 months later. I testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through the entire timeline from Patricia's first visit to the late-night surveillance to the organized trespass. Valerie testified as well, describing what she had witnessed the night of the protest. Detective Reeves provided expert testimony about the investigation and the evidence of ongoing harassment. Patricia's defense tried to paint me as an unreasonable recluse who had overreacted to simple neighbor disputes. They brought in HOA board members who testified about how they had only been trying to find mutually beneficial solutions for community access. But the prosecution systematically dismantled these arguments, showing the jury the spray-painted boulder, the dumped gravel, the false county complaints, and the unhinged voicemail. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on both counts, violating a restraining order and criminal trespass. Patricia Fleming sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, her new attorney whispering urgently in her ear. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later. The prosecution recommended 6 months in county jail plus probation and restitution. The defense argued for probation only, claiming that Patricia was a first-time offender who had made a mistake in judgment, but posed no ongoing threat. Judge Morrison, the same judge who had issued the original restraining order, was not sympathetic. She sentenced Patricia to 90 days in county jail, 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay $20,000 in restitution to me for security system costs, legal fees, and damages. The judge also permanently banned Patricia from coming within 500 feet of my property. Mrs. Fleming, you used your position in the HOA to orchestrate a campaign of harassment against Mr. Jackson, Judge Morrison said during sentencing. You refused to accept that your desires did not override his property rights, and when the legal system ruled against you, you chose to violate a court order rather than accept responsibility. Your actions were not those of a concerned community member. They were those of someone who believes rules do not apply to them. I hope you use your time in custody to reflect on that. Patricia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had not even realized I was carrying. It was finally over. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. The Meadowbrook HOA underwent a complete board election, with Sandra Mitchell and the others who had supported Patricia's crusade all voted out. The new board sent me a letter assuring me that they had no interest in my property or my road, and apologizing again for the previous board's actions. Patricia Fleming served her 90 days and was released on probation. I never saw or heard from her again. According to Valerie's colleague, Patricia and her husband sold their house in Meadowbrook and moved to Arizona, taking their massive RV with them. The HOA storage lot still had plenty of other RVs, but apparently nobody else felt entitled to use my property as their personal shortcut. I received the $20,000 in restitution over time, as Patricia was required to make monthly payments as part of her probation. Between that money and the $15,000 from the HOA, I had actually come out ahead financially, though not by much when I factored in all the stress and time invested. Life gradually returned to normal. Valerie and I continued dating, and she eventually started spending so much time at my place that it made sense for her to move in. We talked about the irony of her living in the property that had caused so much trouble. This isolated 5 acres that someone had been so desperate to claim a piece of. I love it here, Valerie said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. It is peaceful, private, I understand why you fought so hard for it." "It was never really about the road," I said, thinking back over everything that had happened. "It was about the principle. About not letting someone else dictate how I live my life on my own property. If I had given in, even a little, it would have been a never-ending series of demands and compromises." "You were right to stand your ground," Valerie agreed. "Though I think most people would have given up halfway through." Maybe they would have. But I had learned something important through the whole ordeal. I had learned that standing up for yourself, even when it is difficult and expensive and exhausting, matters. I had learned that some people will always think they have a right to control others, and that the only way to stop them is to refuse to be controlled. My private road remained private. I continued to maintain it with my own money, grading it when needed and clearing fallen trees after storms. No RVs ever drove up it except when I had friends visiting. The boulder at the entrance, scrubbed clean of red paint, stood as a quiet marker of property lines and personal boundaries. I heard through the grapevine that the Meadowbrook HOA eventually did widen some of their internal roads to accommodate the larger RVs, paying the full cost themselves, as they should have from the beginning. The project cost them nearly $50,000 and required special permits from the county. None of that was my problem. Sometimes when I drive into Bend and pass the entrance to Meadowbrook, I think about Patricia Fleming and wonder if she learned anything from the experience. I doubt it. People like that rarely do. They move on to the next battle, the next crusade, always convinced they are right and everyone else is the problem. But that is not my concern anymore. I am just a guy living on his 5 acres, working remotely, enjoying the quiet life with someone I care about. My road follows my rules, as it always should have. And if anyone else ever shows up demanding I change it for their convenience, well, I have a whole file cabinet full of legal precedent showing exactly what happens when you try to bully someone off their own land. The story could have ended differently. I could have compromised, widened the road, let the HOA have their shortcut. But that would not have been standing up for myself. It would have been giving in to entitled bullies who thought their convenience mattered more than my rights. And I am glad, every single day, that I chose to fight instead of fold. Valerie and I eventually got married in a small ceremony right there on my property, surrounded by pine trees and a handful of close friends. We turned those 5 acres into a real home, building a life that was ours on our terms. The private road that had caused so much conflict became just another part of our daily routine, a winding gravel path through the trees that led to the life we had chosen, and Patricia Fleming's giant RV. I like to imagine it sitting in some Arizona storage facility, slowly gathering dust, a monument to the fact that not everything is for sale and not everyone can be pushed around. Some roads are private for a reason, and some boundaries are worth defending no matter what it costs. That is my story. That is how I learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought over simple principles, and that standing your ground can be lonely and expensive and frustrating, but ultimately worth it. My road, my rules, and I would make the same choice 100 times over.